It's 2020. Kaiju and dragons are a constant annoyance, but thankfully finding a decent third-party controller for your Mega Drive or Genesis isn't. Not that long ago, good new controllers were few and far between. Sure, there's a ton of cheap options on eBay and Amazon, but if you're a little skeptical of a Funta or Senhai, then I don't blame you. Thankfully, with retro gaming becoming more popular, there are now a number of good options made by people who actually give a shit about quality and authenticity. They do vary quite a bit in terms of pricing and features though, from your basic wired controllers to the high-end wireless stuff. So in this video, I thought I'd recommend two cheap controllers that I think are a good place to start. I'll compare them to the original 6-button Sega controller and an El Cheapo I picked up on eBay. The two controllers in question are the Retrobit 6-button arcade pad and the 8bitdo M30 2.4G wireless. They both come in at under $25 US or roughly $35 Australian, and if you ask me, represent the entry level for new Mega Drive controllers. So first things first, let's look at the cheapo one that I got from eBay. If you're after an economical solution, then something like this $6 pad can seem like an attractive option. But there's a good reason it's so cheap. Have you guessed what it is? Yep, it's complete shit. Everything about it feels cheaply made and flimsy. The buttons are stiff and not very responsive. One of them feels like the plastic inside is giving way, although I think this is just the result of poor design and cheap components, because I have two of them and they feel exactly the same. The cord is really stiff too. If you curl it up, it holds that shape, making it really difficult to use and store. The connector that goes into the console is also a really tight fit, and it's probably going to end up damaging your system long term. The worst thing about it by far though is the D-pad. I mean, just look at it, look how tall it is. I mean, why? It doesn't feel responsive either. It's especially terrible for fighting games or anything that requires fast, precise input. And like everything else on this controller, it feels way too stiff. In all honesty, they should have just called this the stiff as fuck pad. The size is also an issue. I have pretty small hands, so it's not really a problem for me, but if you have big old lumberjack paws, then I think it's going to be pretty uncomfortable to hold for any prolonged period. Now, it does have a mode button for switching between 6 and 3 buttons, and it has a basic turbo feature. These seem to work fine, but they hardly redeem the rest of the problems. Using something like this is likely to make games feel less responsive and almost certainly less enjoyable. Okay, so no surprises there, let's move on. This is the Retrobit 6-button arcade pad, and it's an almost identical replica of the official 6-button controller. It's an officially licensed product, and Retrobit claims that it's the same build quality as the original controller. The shape is so close to the real thing that it might actually be using the same mold, or at the very least a scan of an original pad. Even the boxes have different designs to more accurately reflect the correct region. The cord is a generous 10 feet, which is actually longer than the original controller. It isn't stiff either, so you shouldn't have any issues coiling it up for storage, and the plug is neither too tight or too loose. The buttons feel great. They're snappy with just the right amount of give, and I might go as far as to say that they're better than my OG controller. This could be due to it being almost 30 years old, but either way, the buttons on the Retrobit feel great. The same goes for the D-pad. The design is very close to an official pad, and it has a very similar feel to it. It also has the same mode button for switching between the 6-button and 3-button configuration. Now you can get this in a traditional black colour for the proper OG experience, or you can get it in this clear blue colour. There is also a 2.4G wireless version of this controller, which comes with both a USB adapter and an adapter for the original hardware. This version is almost twice the price though, and not really what I'd consider an entry-level product. If you're simply looking for a no-frills solution to replace an original controller, then I'd say look no further than the Retrobit. At $15 US or $20 Australian, it's extremely good value. So what if you want a bit more freedom, or maybe you want some additional features? If that's the case, then you might want to look at the 8bitdo M30 2.4G. There's also a Bluetooth variant which allows you to use it with other Bluetooth devices such as Windows PC, but you will need to purchase the Bluetooth adapter separately if you want to use it with the Mega Drive. This almost doubles the cost, and according to an article on Retro RGB, the Bluetooth M30 has significantly more latency than the 2.4G versions. So unless you really want to use the controller with other Bluetooth devices, just stick with the 2.4G version because it's much cheaper and actually performs better. Now the 2.4G version comes in two options. You can either get it with a USB adapter to use with the Mega Drive Mini and also the Switch, or you can get it with an adapter to use with the original hardware. The controller is identical regardless of which way you decide to go, and as an added bonus you can use it with the Switch, Windows PC and Raspberry Pi units by connecting it via the supplied USB cable. So if you don't mind a wired connection, you really don't need the USB adapter. The version I have is the one that comes with the adapter for the original hardware, which will also work with the analog Mega SG. It's a bit more expensive than the Retrobit at around 25 US or 35 Australian, but on top of being wireless you do get a couple of extra features. Firstly, it has additional shoulder buttons. These can't be programmed, so they're not the most useful additions, but they do give you a bit more flexibility and they don't get in the way if you don't need them. It has a turbo function which can be assigned per button rather than the all or nothing approach that the cheapo controller has. It also has a home button which you can use to access the menu on both the Mega SG and Mega Drive Mini. Like the Retrobit, the build quality is excellent. Obviously this is a unique design, although the D-pad and button layout is very similar to the original Sega controller. It's extremely comfortable to hold, even more so than the Retrobit, at least in my child-sized hands, although this may not be true for everybody. The D-pad is a little tighter than both the original 6-button pad and the Retrobit, but in practice I haven't noticed any significant difference. It's just as functional and easy to make precise inputs. The buttons are again very similar in feel to an original pad, not quite as close as the Retrobit, but they still make a nice tactile click and work flawlessly. Now there is a tiny amount of latency or lag with this controller, and when I say tiny, it's so small that I'd say that most people won't be able to feel it at all. According to the article I mentioned earlier, the delay is less than a frame. It is there though, and it does make input feel just a fraction less responsive than a wired pad. Look, it really isn't a big deal, I just thought I'd mention it for those who are curious. The M30 has a built-in rechargeable battery which apparently holds 35 hours of playtime. I haven't personally tested this, but I've been using it for about a month and I haven't needed to charge it yet. It turns off automatically after 15 minutes to save power, and it takes about 1 to 2 hours to charge from completely flat to completely full. My only real complaint with the M30 is that the wireless adapter for the original hardware is an extremely snug fit. You really wouldn't want to be plugging and unplugging this on the regular. If it's going to be your main controller though and you plan on just leaving it plugged in all the time, then this obviously won't be an issue. It's certainly not the most authentic, but functionally it's a great little controller that gives you a bit more freedom and utility than a standard pad. Considering everything it does, it's also very competitively priced. As I mentioned at the beginning, I think both the M30 2.4G and the Retrobit are excellent and relatively inexpensive entry-level choices. Either of these will suit people who just want something to use with their old systems, as well as the hardcore enthusiast that's likely to spend hundreds of hours using them. It really comes down to what you prefer, wireless with a few extra options or a more traditional pad. My personal pick of the two is the M30. It's really comfy, easy to store, and not having to disconnect it reduces wear and tear on my original console. The Retrobit is very close though. It feels just like using the real thing, possibly even better. And when you consider that the original pad cost $20 US back in '93, at $15 it really is excellent value. Anyway, if you weren't sure what kind of controller you should get, then I hope this was helpful. Like I said, there are other decent but more expensive options, so let me know if you'd like me to do a similar video on those. Otherwise, keep it real.